Hi. So my talk today is about monospaced fonts and fonts for code. This talk, it's kind of like an intersection of history, programming, and typefaces. So I think I hit some sort of nerd trifecta. I've talked to a lot of programmers about fonts, and pretty much people are split. You get the people who are like, I use Consolas, or I use Source Code Pro, and everything else is crap, and it's like code is illegible otherwise. And then you get people who are like, I've never thought about this in my life, and I use the default whatever came with my coding editor. Now, I can't convince you that fonts matter for code, because coding typography is not like any other kind of typography. If you were like my client, like in a normal typographic situation, I could say that the typeface establishes the tone of voice for your design. It helps you to communicate clearly. It kind of separates you, makes you distinct from your competition. But coding typography isn't like that, because in coding typography, the only person that matters is you. So if typography is tone of voice, then coding typography is kind of like singing in the shower, because it doesn't, the performance is only for you. You don't have to be good, it doesn't have to be great, as long as it makes you happy. But there is an entire genre of coding fonts that are designed to make coding a more pleasant experience. And for the most part, the benefits they offer are pretty intangible. But that doesn't mean that they're not there. And I love fonts that are tailored to a specific problem. They're much more interesting to me than like the all-purpose generic sans serif that can do everything. Because I like fonts, type design is design, and design is about solving problems. So I'm going to talk about some of these problems, talk a little bit about the history of coding fonts, and then share with you some of my experiences in creating a coding font and some of the specific issues I tried to address. I'll start at the beginning for me. I wrote HTML in middle school, and this is what my desktop looked like. This is Notepad on Windows 95, and the font is Fixis. And Fixis is actually a really great font. It hits all the key things that a coding font needs to do. It's well-suited to low-resolution environments, looks good when it's small, there's generous space in between the letters, and they're pretty hard to confuse. Like, for example, like the M looks really different than like two N's next to each other. The zero, hints at a slash, but doesn't totally obscure that, the counterform. And the capital I has serif, so it looks good monospace. And there are prominent symbols and punctuation. So for my favorite character is the exclamation mark, which is, it's kind of beautiful, actually. So Notepad is a lot different from the coding environments we have now. Line numbers, we got directory trees, breakpoint markers, cold folding. That's very hard to say. When the code collapses and expands, you guys know. Thank you. Syntax highlighting, another thing. I can say that. Just look at how many more buttons there are than Notepad. It's very different. But fundamentally, we're still looking at one font at one size. We're still constrained by that monospaced grid. So typographically speaking, not a whole lot has changed. In a lot of coding editors, you only get very basic typographic options. You just get to choose one font. A lot of times you can't even choose the line spacing between the fonts, so like line height, other things that you'd expect. And yeah, right, like you get access to fancy typographic things like open type features and stuff like that. That happens in Sublime Text and Atom and more kind of newer code editors, but a lot of the traditional ones, you're stuck with pretty basic options. And so today I work as a typeface designer, and so I care about options. Typeface design is full of redundant tasks, and you do the same thing to a bunch of different letters hundreds and hundreds of times. My colleague Peter Van Blockland says, design is the first time you figure out something. Every other time you do it after that, it's production. It's not really design anymore. And I try to take that to heart in my design process. And I want to spend more time drawing. But because I have so much production work to get done, and I'm lazy, I end up automating a lot of my tasks. So my screen, which I want to look like this, usually looks more like this. So because I spend a good portion of my day not looking at the letters I'm drawing, but the letters in my coding editor, I got very interested in them and decided I should draw a coding font for myself, not really having any idea what went into it. And 2 years later, I released this typeface called Input. So this is the font that I look at when I'm working on my other fonts. So, what this process taught me is that typography for code is all about possibilities and limitations. Theoretically, anything is possible, right? But throughout the history of programming, technology has forced us to shape our letter forms after kind of what our machines want them to be. The designer, actually, of Zapfino is Hermann Zapf. I hope I said that correctly. And he was one of the most celebrated calligraphers and typeface designers of the 20th century. In the 1960s, he was one of the pioneers of digital type, actually. And I mean, he was super psyched about all the possibilities that fonts for computers could bring. It would liberate us from the dust of the past. I can say words. 2 years later, reality set in, and all of a sudden he's saying, who will then need to wonder if the emergent letter is cold and soulless, right? I mean, and these two quotes to me by the same guy in the span of 2 years illustrate to me the excitement and frustration of working in ever-changing technology. It offers so many possibilities, but at the same time, we're always left wondering, like, what will we gain, what will we lose, working within the limitations of the technology we have in front of us. So the main limitation, of course, for coding fonts is that they're monospaced. In a fixed-width environment, you have the potential to do a lot. I guess coding fonts can be really cool and also really ugly, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Having a fixed-width font, you divide it up into a grid like this. And since our alphabet has wide and narrow letters, we have to stretch and squeeze them to get them to fit within this grid. It's like trying to get people of all shapes and sizes, onto the same into the same airport seat, airplane seat. Like nobody is very comfortable. Compare this to a proportionally spaced font where the letters are allowed to take up the space that they need and lines break where they kind of naturally would. Monospaced, so this is one of my favorite monospaced fonts because it kind of illustrates what monospaced type design is all about, and that's filling space. And it actually, the letters are packed into these squares like sardines. I would be remiss not to mention that in other cultures, writing on a fixed width is not an unusual thing. And even in the history of Western design, this is a writing method called stoichodon, where Greek letters were actually lined up in columns and rows, and that's how people read. But for most of the history of Latin typography, columns have mostly signified data. This is a book from 1620 on algorithms. And the reason that columns are useful for data is pretty much because of decimal notation. When we switched from Roman numerals to Arabic numerals, all of a sudden, the length of a number actually is a signifier of its value. So it's really handy to line this stuff up in columns. This is why even normal fonts offer tabular figures. Typographer Robert Bringhurst defines type as nothing very interesting or mysterious, just mechanized writing. And it's true that the invention of the printing press totally revolutionized how books were published, right? Instead of scribes, meticulously writing books, we could mass produce them on printing presses. But the actual act of writing, of composing text, remained pretty much unchanged until the 19th century. Shakespeare was not, composing his plays with metal type. He was writing them longhand. And this happened well into the 19th century. Within our lifetimes, we've seen mechanical writing become the vast majority of the writing that we do. So to me, it's an interesting distinction between readability, what a font needs to be legible and to be comfortable reading, and writability. Like, what does a font need to kind of give the writer appropriate feedback to let them know that, like, they're writing well? I don't know. This all started with the typewriter. This is not the first typewriter ever invented, but it's the first commercially successful one, the Scholes and Glidden typewriter. I've seen it argue that it was the first typewriter that a person could operate considerably faster than they could write by hand. In real-time mechanized composition, when one letter is input at a time, the machine is vastly simplified if it always has to advance the same width after every letter. And so that's why the first typewriter fonts were monospaced. This is a letter by Mark Twain, his first letter on a typewriter. He was kind of confused by this newfangled contraption. But that was characteristic of early typewriter fonts, all caps, as simple as possible. As the typewriter evolved, we started to get shift keys and other, that allowed lowercase. But still, that very simplified letter and the fixed width remained. This was actually the source for one of the more famous digital typefaces, FF Trixie. And Trixie is a really interesting typeface. This is a little diversion. Because Eric von Bloch, the designer, released a sophisticated version with so much detail in the letter forms that the font weighed in at 17 million points. So it really tried to mimic the effect of getting, that like the smack of the typewriter as it hit a page. As the 20th century progressed, typewriters began to ship with a variety of styles, including, because I'm in Germany, monospaced black letter. Courier was one of the earliest kind of modern typewriter fonts. In this advertisement, I think is cool because it compares Courier to a Dachshund. It's long and low. It's totally different from a lot of the previous fonts. Geometric simplicity. So here's a quote from the ad. For sparkling correspondence, brilliant advertising, attractive commercial work, it's typographically natural. Courier gives that modern progressive look to your copy. Now you notice that it's not described in functional terms, but it's described because it was created to create it creates a contemporary writing experience. This is another long and low font from more recent years. This is Pitch by Chris Soursby. It was based on the type of a Baby Empire portable typewriter. And it's kind of the antithesis to Trixie, which I just showed you, because it's modern, clean, understated, and has a way of saying very little. Electric typewriters ushered in a new era of typography. This is the IBM Selectric, and fonts became easily replaceable because they existed on this ball, this element that rotated and as your typewriter, as you hit the keys. You can see here how the design of the ball shows the columns of the monospaced font. Here are a variety of fonts made for the IBM Selectric, and if you pay attention to that very last one, the unusual script typeface, that was the inspiration for Operator Mono, which was released just this year, whose most distinctive feature is its pretty wild cursive italic, which really sets apart the italic fonts from Roman text. Prestige, another Selectric font, was the basis for Triplicate by Matthew Butterick. Based on this era of Triplicate is modeled on several fonts, actually, in a time where designers were treating monospacing not nearly as a limitation, but also as an opportunity, right? They were trying to kind of explore the the potential within the monospace limitation. Sans serif monos are able to feel a little more natural than their counterparts. There are no serifs on the M or the W, so they can get a little wider. But usually they would keep serifs on the I, L, and possibly the J. There are tons of contemporary monospace fonts, too many for me to talk about. But what I wanted to show you with this is Akarat, is it's really impressive to be able to get the M next to an I not looking totally horrible and not really jumping out at you. And I mean, it's actually quite a feat to do. This is Nitty, which has its roots in a 19th century grotesque, but kind of puts it on a monospace grid. And this typeface is what is used by Typewriter, which is all about writability, all about kind of creating a quiet, simple space for writing text. As writing began to migrate from typewriters to computers, monospace fonts migrated with them. Most of the input and output was handled by a teletypewriter at the beginning, and this is an example of this is a digital revival of a teletypewriter font from the IBM 1403 machine. It's one of the more authentic revivals from the period, and it's reminiscent of the all caps fonts that I showed you at the beginning of the typewriter era. Rather than using pre-made letters on typewriters, other computers opted to print using a dot matrix. That allowed them to have varied fonts and print anything, as long as it subscribed to that grid. Naturally, the shapes of the earliest letters that appeared on screen also subscribed to a grid, and were kept very simple for performance reasons. This is 1964. By 1969, you can see that the computers could handle a lot more, and so fonts began to look more like their print equivalents. The pixel-based fonts dominated much of the early, personal computer era. This is the Apple II font. The uppercase is super consistent, although the A is super angular, and the G is a little. Can I find a G now? Ugh, hex. Never mind. Here is. Can I laser that? This is a Commodore 64. The most popular computer, single model computer sold of all time, I think, or at least until we got to Mac. It's an awesome machine. But the font was super bold, and it was bold because it was aimed at kind of being shown on low quality TVs. And the inconsistencies across the font would be intentional, so that, A, for example, let's see, come on, A versus 4, I versus 1, and even T versus 7, that little serif, makes everything very distinguishable. DOS was the main operating system for the IBM PC personal computer, and this actually included, serifs. This is a weird design because it has both sans serif and serif almost arbitrarily mixed together. But so while it wasn't like a smooth reading experience, it really had that, the distinction was just, through the roof on this one. Beyond their practical purpose, bitmap fonts present an interesting formal exercise. This is a 3-pixel high X-height bitmap font by Frederick Berlin. A single letter doesn't have to be recognizable, as long as the combination of letters can form a coherent word. And so pixel fonts really force you to reduce the letters to their necessary elements. This is probably my favorite pixel font. This is called Elementar, released by Typotech. And it's less of a font and more of an entire system where it explores how letters transform across grids. And this is underwear, which really convinced me that you didn't have to lose expressivity by designing with pixels. Look at that italic. It's upright because having a slant would be too weird, but it's still super expressive. Okay. So those fonts that I just showed you are designed for anything on the screen, not code specifically. But fonts like Fixsys, which I showed you earlier, really left their mark on the next generation of outline-based fonts that followed them. This is Monaco. It started like all of Apple's other fonts as a tiny pixel font right there, but it was converted to an outline font, and some of the low-res things remain, like the single-story A, instead of the more conventional form, which does cause legibility issues with O, but it's less crowded in a low-resolution environment. Monaco was replaced by Menlo as the default monospace for OS X or OS X and also Xcode. Yes, it's based on Vera Sans, and it's like totally fine. It's much more generic. And Vera Sans is also the source for Hack, which was released recently. And the difference between the two is super subtle. Really, they just changed the punctuation and the symbols. And like the dot on the 0, the position of the asterisk, very small things, but based on the same font. This is another kind of vanilla coding font. This is done by Google. A lot of the coding fonts done for larger companies tend to be more vanilla. And this is Consolas. So if this is vanilla, this is like the fancy vanilla with like the little black specks in it. Because, this is, to me, is the most beautiful monospace typeface that exists. It's designed by Lucas de Groot, and it has proportions that are ever so slightly closer to normal text. It's super open. It hardly even feels monospace, and that's, I think, the highest compliment you can give a monospace font. And he did this by kind of some systematic cheating. If you measure the stem of the M, compare that to the stem of the I, you can see the I and the N are both a little heavier, right? Because the M is so crowded, he made it a little lighter, so it wouldn't jump out so much. He also did some tricks like lowering the crossbar of the F in order to kind of keep that space tangible and keep these these terminals super open. Another one of my favorite fonts is Anonymous Pro. And I like this one because we're moving away from the kind of like the more generic looking ones. And this actually has some personality. It has this weird mix of serifs, just like the DOS font. And it was actually based on a pixel font designed earlier. You can see, so the serifs on the D, the F, the I, the J, the L. These kind of help give it a little personality, I think. And the designer, Mark Simonson, kind of traced over these, but tried to keep the original kind of integrity of the letters. I love fonts that are based on pixel fonts. I just think they look kind of goofy and weird, so I also like fonts that are kind of have that double-story G. This is just me personally. One of my favorites, this is Source Code Pro. And this is kind of like the long and low style, not so dissimilar from Courier. I'll show you, this is the last one, I think, sorry. This is Pragmata Pro. It's compared to the others, you can see it's so narrow. And it has that distinct diamond 0, the little slash in it. And this is one of the most complete monospaced fonts available. It even has a monospaced Fraktur black letter. It's pretty intense. There are tons I didn't talk about. So maybe the font that you use isn't, I didn't even mention, Monoid, Roboto Mono, Hasklig, Deja Vu, M+. There are just too many. This is a great site that kind of indexes programming fonts. And even has a tester so you can test them out. Programmingfonts.org. Yes. So I think you kind of get the idea now that coding fonts are kind of variations on a theme. And as I developed Input, I kind of had it in my head that I could create some sort of ultimate coding font, one ring to rule them all, I guess. And that is kind of like a little bit hubristic to think that I could do that, and I'm okay admitting that now. But it was kind of a silly idea because the more I talk to programmers and the more I design my own typeface, I realize that there's really no ultimate coding font. And this is because typography typography for code is typography for the self. And typography for the self is the typography of comfort. So it's all about what makes you comfortable. It's really as simple as people like what they like. And all I could do with Input is give them options. If the code you're looking at is like this, right? 5 lines of pretty dense code, you might want a very different font than if you're looking at this, where you have tons and tons of data. If you have a small screen, a narrow screen, or you use a code editor that allows you to split your screen vertically, you might want a narrower font. And if you split your screen horizontally, you might want a wider font, but one with tighter line spacing so you can see a couple more lines on your screen. You may use your font against a light background or a dark background. You may or may not use syntax highlighting to make your code different colors. And there are a million other factors that influence the choice of font, right? So in order to get an ideal font, the user has to be able to select what is best for them. So writability, to me, is clarity plus feedback plus flexibility. It's really an ergonomics issue. It's not dissimilar from like having an ergonomic keyboard or having a comfy chair. Like the chair you're sitting in is probably fine for 45 minutes to listen to a guy talk about fonts, but it may not be the chair that you want to sit on for the rest of your life. And maybe you want to switch it up, get a standing desk, whatever. This is all about personal preference. So I followed that same path that I showed you earlier, and also the path of Verdana in Georgia, and I created my own pixel font for Input. It forced me to make clear letter forms, no in-between decisions. It's either a pixel is there or a pixel is not. I then traced that pixel font with an outline font, resulting in something that's is pretty robust, pretty good on screen. And it has spacing that's like a little off. It's not quite, it doesn't have like the same flow as your normal proportional font, or sorry, your normal, design proportional font. And but it also isn't as, sorry. Yeah, and it has, yeah, we're good on that one. I did not try to thwart the aesthetics of the machine either, right? I tried to keep that pixel font vibe going in the outline font. And I really tried to make it so that when you typed it, you could tell that every character appeared. The period is huge. I wanted feedback or confirmation when I typed. I wanted the spacing between letters to be super wide, so every letter can stand on its own. And I paid special attention to those tricky characters that font designers always ignore, like the curly brackets, the @ sign, the less than sign, things that are important in code, but not really important in general typesetting. Like all other coding fonts, I tried to keep it very distinguishable. Often confusing letters like I, L, and 1. Wanted to keep those very separate. Wanted to keep that space in the exclamation point very large so that it never filled in when used at a small size. And same thing with the 0, the O and the 0. Distinguishing it from the all these other letters that at small sizes can actually look kind of similar. The issue, though, is that if you talk to any programmer, you realize that nobody agrees on which forms are most distinguishable, right? Some people like this, some people like that. So my solution with input is to give them everything, right? So you get a double story or a single story A. Same thing with G. For I and L, you get 5 options with different serif arrangements. For 0, you get dotted, or slashed, or a flat top, which at high-res environments is actually pretty much good enough. You don't even need anything in the middle. And you get an asterisk that is aligned to the top, or one that's aligned to the middle, like the other math operators. And this way, every user can download a different version of input and use what they like, whatever floats your boat. I tried to take care with some certain characters that are very special to code, like the grav. I was talking about input to Donald Knuth, and he mentioned that he always uses the grav accent as the opening quote, when he does like a quotation. So I was sure to make it the same size as the other quotation marks, whereas in a normal font, it might look more like a grav accent. I was sure to include powerline characters. If any of you use Vim, you may be familiar with this styling plugin that allows you to have those little fancy arrows and stuff. And I made sure to draw those at the correct weight and width for input so that they weren't just like the generic characters. I think the most controversial character in input were the curly brackets. I like them. They're nice and curly. Other people were not as big of fans. This actually isn't even the worst. Someone else on Reddit said they wanted to use Comic Sans for their code over this. So, whatever. Can't please them all. I ended up drawing an extra alternate for the brackets so that if people want a more sober bracket experience, they got it. I also wanted to make sure that the proportions and weight were also flexible, because you can't really, as all web designers know, you can't always rely on a font appearing the same weight on all screens. It's influenced by screen brightness, screen resolution, OS and app rendering, and also color. So, for example, if you use input against a light background, to get the equivalent stem weight, you'd want to use 1 weight darker against a black background. Did I say that right? 1 weight lighter against a black background. And that way, so you can kind of counteract like the halo effect that you get when you set type against a dark background. So I designed 7 weights for input, going through them. So I tried to keep them pretty finely gradated so people could get the exact weight that worked best in their particular screen. And then, if at nighttime you want to have like the lights go down, you want to change your style, all the fonts are there for you to do that. I tried to do the same thing for width because it's very important how many characters will actually appear on a line before a line breaks or it goes off the screen. I drew 4 widths for input. And you can see this is like input doing some like squats or something. And I tried to keep these widths, again, finely gradated, so everyone could choose what width fit best in their editor. Line spacing, also, because of the lack of line spacing preferences, I also had to worry about the actual line spacing metadata within the font. So I'm able to offer different line spacing, and you can choose that. We built like this little online interface for users, so you can choose your best weight, your width. Down there, you can select which alternates you like, and then you can just download that customized version. So your version of input is not like anyone else's version of input. And yeah, that brings us back to limitations and possibilities. The way we code still lives in the shadow of early computers, even if those computers are now just decoration on a stage. Take mathematical operators. I mean, we have Unicode now, but the operators in our programs are all ASCII, right? And some designers, I didn't do this for input, but other designers have actually created programming ligatures. This is a Fira code. You can see that these ligatures take, the normal, your normal not equal. And so it's first exclamation mark equal, and then switches it to that. It's a little hacky, a little problematic, because you can't actually see what you're typing, and your cursor will appear right in the middle of that ligature, which can be a little annoying. But still, if you write in Haskell or another language where two-character operators happen all the time, this might be something that is appealing to you. And I've gotten actually a lot of requests to add this to input myself. For input, I really focused on the idea of proportionality. And that's because code has changed a lot since the 60s and 70s. This is machine code, which is largely focused on influencing and manipulating bits of data. You can see that it's very column-oriented, right? Because you're actually finding bits of data and changing them around. As assembly language came along, and computers were very focused on those step-by-step instructions. That's the only thing we could give them at the beginning. Today, programming is a lot higher level. We're not telling programs what to do. We're explaining complex data structures to them. We're describing things, not giving line-by-line instructions. It's more similar to natural language, and there are very few columns of data left to communicate. When typewriters kind of progressed beyond their mechanical limitations, they started to offer executive spacing, which is pretty much proportional spacing. And so I figured that we could do the same. The problem being that most proportional fonts are really crappy for code. I can hardly see in Helvetica, I can hardly see that I typed a period. It's so small and narrow. Verdana is a little better, because it was actually designed for small size reading on a screen. But for input, I tried to take all that was good in monospaced fonts and bring it to a proportional design. And that way, there's a little bit more of a continuous flow to text, but each letter is given the space that it needs. Because monospaced fonts today can actually be a little misleading, can show me relationships that I don't really need to know about. For example, why does it matter that my name is the same number of letters as Hungry Hungry Hippo? It's useless information. Proportional fonts, on the other hand, can show us things that monospaced fonts can't. Like the typo in this block of code is obscured by a monospaced font, but in a proportional font, you can see where the alignment differs, and all of a sudden the typo is, it appears. In input, I tried to make sure there were no meaningless shifts. If you have syntax highlighting that includes different weights, I let those weights duplex, and same with the italics. A lot of people thought I was a little nuts for suggesting this, especially if you're a person that comments on the right. But I never did this, and I don't like the idea of having to manage a whole second column of code over there. And this is a cool piece of technology called elastic tab stops. You can see it up there, where it'll actually automatically move your right-hand comments based on the code you're writing. Right now, it's only implemented as a Visual Studio plugin, but hopefully, if there's a demand for it, it'll be more widely implemented. So I also wanted to give the programmers the same stylistic options that designers would normally get. So in addition to input sans, I also created a serif version. I use it less for code and more for text composition, and it kind of provides a nice contrast to the sans. So that makes a 3-part family in 7 weights, 4 widths, plus italics. It's a massive family, and the idea is that any single person will only use 1 or 2 or 4 of these styles at a time. You know, it's all about flexibility, and it's kind of up to you what you want to do with them. Since some code editors like Atom use CSS for their stylistic sets, you could actually create for yourself a responsive coding environment. As your screen gets narrower, your font gets narrower too. We actually did the same thing on the input website, where the mobile version, you get a narrower font the narrower your screen gets. I also ended up replacing my system font with input. Got a little bit obsessed back when Apple switched the system font to Helvetica. And so yeah, if you look back at my Atom screen, here, every single piece of text displayed is an input. So I'm not exactly sure what happens next. I want to explore the idea of even a richer coding typography where weights, widths, sans and serif kind of are mashed together. Here, my class name, my method name, my strings, and my comment all appear in serif, and the rest appears in sans. And that just gives me a little more, the texture is different enough that it just gives me a little bit more distinguishability between these different kinds of code. And what about size and all the other hierarchies that typography can communicate? Is this useful to us? I'm not exactly sure. And we have the power to We have the power to use typography, I think, to make our code easier for us to read. I encourage you to try ditching the default, not just for 5 minutes, but give it 2 days at least. Just give it a go. Doesn't have to be with input, and see for yourself how it influences the way that you write code. I encourage you to give your own workspace the attention that you give to the websites and apps that you ship, because you matter too. And yeah, I feel like it's time for our coding typography to catch up with not only the complexity of the code that we write these days, but also to the complexity and richness of the rest of typographic design. Yeah, and how you do that is up to you. Thanks.